Mystics of Konya. Episode 001. The Wanderer at the Inn. Shams arrives. The light over Konya was the color of old honey. It had settled in that slow way that autumn light settles, over the low rooftops and the pale stone walls, over the wooden balconies leaning gently toward the streets, over the carved doorways and the dusty fountains where, an hour earlier, women had filled their copper jugs and gone home. The day was folding itself away now, soft as a worn prayer mat at the end of evening prayers, and the sky was no longer blue, but a kind of deep, drowsy gold, fading slowly into the pink and lavender of dusk. It was the time of year when the wind from the plains carried the faint scent of dry grass and wood smoke, when the apricot trees in the courtyards had long since dropped their leaves, when shepherds led their thin flocks back through the dust toward the edge of the city, and the city itself, the old city of Konya, breathed in and breathed out like a sleeper preparing for night. The minarets stood quietly against the fading sky. The domes of the older mosques caught the last gold of the sun and held it for a moment, as if reluctant to let it go. And from somewhere, from one of the small mosques near the center perhaps, or from a courtyard where a teacher had gathered his students for evening, a voice rose, slow and gentle, calling the city to prayer. The voice rose, and the city listened. It was the kind of voice that did not seem in any hurry. It moved over the rooftops, the way water moves over smooth stones, and it carried in it the long patience of 1,000 evenings, and 10,000, and more. The shopkeepers in the bazaar paused. The blacksmith let his hammer rest. The woman sweeping her courtyard set down her broom and lifted her face, just slightly, toward the sound. And in a small upper room, by a window facing west, an older man with a soft gray beard and tired eyes set down the book he had been reading and closed it with the care of someone closing the door of a beloved house. His name was Jalaluddin. The people of Konya called him Mevlana, our master, our teacher, our beloved one, though he himself did not yet think of his life in those terms. He was, in those days, simply a teacher, simply a jurist, simply a man known throughout the city for his careful learning and his gentle voice, for the slow and steady way he moved through scripture and law, the way another man might move through a long, familiar orchard. He rose from where he had been sitting on a low cushion. He smoothed the heavy cloth of his robe. He stood for a moment near the window, looking out over the city that he loved, watching how the last light caught on the curve of a distant dome, and he listened to the call to prayer, the way one might listen to the breathing of a sleeping child, not because the sound is new, but because it is dear. In the room behind him, a candle had been lit, though it was not yet needed. The flame trembled slightly in the cool draft from the window. The walls were lined with books, more books than most houses in Konya contained, more books than most men had read in their lifetimes, and beside the books were stacks of papers covered in careful script, and beside the papers a small wooden writing desk, and on the desk an inkwell of pale green glass, and beside the inkwell a single pen. He had been writing earlier. He had been answering a letter from a student in a city far to the east, a student who had asked him a careful question about the law, and he had given a careful answer in return. The letter was sealed now. It would be carried away in the morning with the next caravan. And the room was quiet, and the candle trembled, and the call to prayer ended, and Jalaluddin lowered his head for a moment, in the silence, before he turned and went down the narrow staircase to the courtyard below. In the courtyard, The fountain whispered. It was a small fountain, set into the wall on the eastern side, and its water rose and fell with that gentle, ceaseless music that fountains have, the music that says nothing in particular, but says it kindly, the music that one can listen to for a lifetime without ever growing tired. Beside the fountain, a few of his students were waiting. They were young men, mostly, with serious faces and dust on their shoes, and they greeted him quietly, with bowed heads, and he greeted them in return. They went together into the small mosque attached to the madrasa, the school where he taught. They stood in a row. They prayed. And for the long, slow movement of those prayers, the world fell into a deeper quiet, as it always did, as the world has always done, in the hour when men and women set down whatever they are carrying and turn for a few moments toward something larger than themselves. When the prayer was finished, Jalaluddin sat for a while on the carpeted floor of the mosque, his back against a pillar, and his students sat around him. They did not press him for words. They knew him. They knew that he would speak when he was ready, and that until then it was a kindness, both to him and to themselves, to simply sit with him in the soft amber light of the oil lamps, in the smell of old wool and old incense, in the deep, settled quiet of an evening that had nothing to prove. After a long while he spoke. His voice was low. He spoke about the day's lesson, about a passage they had been studying together, about a word in that passage that could mean many things, and about how a man should choose, with patience, which of those meanings to lean toward, and when. He spoke as he often spoke, gently, with long pauses, with the kind of certainty that does not raise its voice. His students listened. One of them, the youngest, sat with his chin in his hand and his eyes half closed, drinking in every word. Another wrote slowly on a small piece of paper balanced on his knee. And while Jalaluddin spoke, while the lamps burned low and the night settled fully over the city, while his students leaned toward him, as flowers lean toward a window, something else was happening, far away, on a road outside the walls of Konya. A traveler was approaching. He was alone. He had been walking for many days and many weeks, and, if the truth were told, many years, though the years did not weigh on him in quite the way they weigh on other men. He walked with the slow, unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere in particular to be, and yet somehow, in his unhurried walking, he covered great distances and arrived where he needed to arrive, often before those who had set out with purpose. He was wrapped in a dark cloak, the color of charred wood, of damp earth at the end of a rainy day, and he wore a turban that had once been white, but was now the color of old paper, of dust that had traveled with him through many provinces. His face was thin. His beard was dark and a little wild, like a small forest that had not been tended in some time. His eyes were the kind of eyes that, once seen, were not easily forgotten. Deep, very deep, with a quiet fire burning somewhere far back in them, the way a single lamp can be glimpsed through the window of a distant house at night. He carried very little. A small leather bag over one shoulder, a walking stick that he leaned on lightly, more from habit than from need, a wooden cup tied to his belt. Nothing more. He walked, and the road moved beneath his feet, and the road had been moving beneath his feet for a long time. His name was Shamsuddin. The men in the cities he had passed through called him Shams. Shams of Tabriz, they would say, when they whispered to one another about him after he had gone. The strange dervish who came and stayed only a little while. The wanderer who would sit for hours in silence and then say one thing that they could not forget for the rest of their lives. Shams of Tabriz, the one who would not stay. He had been many places. He had been in Tabriz, where he was born, where the snow lay heavy on the mountains in winter, and the markets in summer were full of carpets and pomegranates and the smell of dried rose petals. He had been in Baghdad, where he had walked the long streets and listened to the scholars argue, and had said nothing, and then gone away. He had been in Damascus, where the white domes shone in the morning, where he had stood at the gates of the great mosque, and felt his heart move in a way he could not explain. He had been in Aleppo, in Mosul, in cities whose names he no longer counted, and in every city he had searched quietly, in the streets and in the mosques, and in the libraries, and in the wine shops, and in the prayer halls, and in the markets, for one thing only. He was searching for a companion. He was searching for one soul. He did not, when he tried to explain it to himself, know quite how to say it. He only knew that somewhere in the world there was a person who could meet him as he was, who could bear the weight of what he carried, who could look into his eyes without flinching, who could hear what he said without needing it explained, and who could give back to him, in turn, an answering depth, an answering light. Not a student, not a master, not a follower, not a teacher. Something else. Something for which the world did not, perhaps yet, have a name. For many years he had searched, and for many years he had not found. He had prayed for this in his own quiet way, walking on the long roads. He had said into the wind, into the empty sky, show me one soul who can mirror what burns in me. Show me one. And the wind had carried his words away, and the sky had given no answer, and he had walked on. But lately, and he was not sure when lately had begun, perhaps a month ago, perhaps two, something had been turning, like a key in a lock, somewhere deep in his chest. He had been in a small village, far to the east, sitting under a tree in a dry courtyard, and he had heard a voice, not with his ears, but with that other listening that lay deeper than the ears, and the voice had said one word. The word was Konya. Just that, Konya, and then it had gone. He had risen the next morning, and tied his sandals, and set out walking westward. Now, after many weeks, the city was close. He could see, on the horizon ahead of him, the faint outline of walls. He could see the soft blur of minarets against the deepening blue. He could see the small fires of a caravanserai just outside the city gate, where travelers gathered each evening before continuing their journeys, and where, on this evening, a tired wanderer might find a place to lay his head. He walked toward the fires. He walked slowly. The cold of evening was rising from the ground, and his breath made small clouds in the air, and he was tired, more tired than he liked to admit even to himself, and he thought, in a quiet way, about how good it would be to sit and to drink something warm and to rest his feet, but mostly he thought about the word, Konya. He turned the word in his mind the way a child turns a small stone in the palm of a hand. He wondered what was in this city that the voice had brought him to. He wondered if, this time, finally, his long searching would find its quiet end. He did not allow himself to hope, exactly. He had learned long ago that hope can be a kind of restlessness, and he had no use for restlessness any longer. But somewhere beneath his careful, patient thoughts, something soft and bright moved, like the first edge of dawn, moving along the rim of the eastern hills. He walked, and the road moved beneath his feet, and the lights of the Caravanserai grew slowly closer in the dusk. The Caravanserai stood just beyond the western gate of the city, set a little back from the road, a low building of pale stone with a heavy wooden door. It had been built many years before, in the time of one of the old sultans, for the use of travelers along the merchant routes, and it had served its purpose well. Its walls were thick. Its courtyard was wide. Its rooms were small but warm, and the food, if one was lucky, was simple and good. That evening, the Caravanserai was not crowded. Autumn was a quiet time for travel. The great caravans had already passed through, going south toward the warmer cities, or east toward the markets of Persia, and only the smaller groups remained. A pair of merchants returning home with light pockets, a family making a slow pilgrimage, a young man on his way to find work as a scribe in a distant town. There was room that night for a stranger. The innkeeper was a heavy-set man, with broad hands and a careful, watchful face. He had run the Caravanserai for many years. He had seen many men come and go. He had grown skilled at reading travelers, at telling the merchant from the pilgrim, the poet from the thief, the rich man pretending to be poor, and the poor man pretending to be rich. He prided himself, in his quiet way, on this skill, and he believed that very few men had ever passed through his gate without being read. That evening, as the last light died beyond the western hills, he stood in the wide doorway of the Caravanserai, leaning lightly against the frame, and watched the road. He saw a figure approaching. The figure was alone, and walking slowly, and dressed in a dark cloak that the dust had darkened further. The figure carried a small leather bag. The figure leaned on a walking stick. The innkeeper watched, and he tried, as was his habit, to read the man before the man arrived. But he could not. This puzzled him. He could not say, looking at this man, what manner of man this was. Not a merchant. There was no greed in the carriage of the shoulders. Not a pilgrim. There was no piety in the lift of the head. Or rather there was. But it was a different kind of piety, one the innkeeper had no word for. Not a scholar, exactly. Not a wandering preacher. Not a beggar. Something else. Something the innkeeper, with all his years of practiced reading, could not place. The man came up to the door. He stopped. He looked at the innkeeper. And the innkeeper, who had stared down many travelers in his time, found that he had to look away. There was something in those eyes. Not anger, not pride, not threat. Something deeper than any of those. The innkeeper would say, later, when his wife asked him about the stranger, that it had felt as though the man had looked, not at his face, but at something inside him, and had looked at that inside thing kindly, and had also, somehow, seen everything about it, and had not been troubled. "Peace be upon you," said the stranger. His voice was low. There was the trace of an accent in it. Eastern, the innkeeper thought. Perhaps Persian, perhaps further. "And upon you, peace," said the innkeeper. "You are weary. Come in." The stranger came in. He moved through the wide entryway and into the inner courtyard, where a small fire burned in an iron brazier, and a few other travelers sat on benches along the walls, talking quietly. He looked around. He did not seem to be looking at the others. He seemed to be looking at the building itself, at the worn stones, at the shadows in the corners, at the wooden beams overhead. He nodded once, slightly as if confirming something to himself, and then he sat down on an empty bench, set his bag beside him, and rested his walking stick against the wall, the innkeeper brought him bread and a bowl of lentil soup and a cup of weak tea. The stranger thanked him. He ate slowly. He ate with the manner of a man who had eaten little for many days, but who did not, even now, allow himself to eat with hunger. He took small, careful bites. He drank the tea with the cup held in both hands. He did not look at the other travelers. He did not look at anything in particular. He sat there, in the soft glow of the brazier, and ate, and the night settled deeper outside the walls of the Caravanserai. And one by one, without quite knowing why they were doing it, the other travelers began to glance at him. A merchant, a man with a small pointed beard, looked at him from across the courtyard and could not, for some time, look away. The merchant had been telling a story to his companion, something about a deal that had gone wrong in a market in the south, and he found, halfway through, that the story had left him, and he could not remember where it had been going. He looked at the stranger. The stranger did not look back. The merchant looked down at his hands. A young man, a scribe by profession, with ink stains on his fingers, watched the stranger from the corner of his eye. The young man had been writing in a small notebook. He had been writing a letter to his mother. He looked at the stranger, and he found that the words he had been writing seemed suddenly very small and far away, and he could not, for some time, return to them. He set down his pen. He stared into the fire. An older woman, traveling with her grown daughter on some quiet pilgrimage, looked at the stranger for a long moment, and then leaned toward her daughter and whispered something. The daughter looked. The daughter whispered back. They both looked. They both looked away. They did not look again, but neither of them, for the rest of the evening, was quite able to forget that he was there. The innkeeper watched all of this. He watched the stranger eat. He watched the others watching the stranger. He watched the way the air in the courtyard had changed, the way the conversations had grown softer, the way even the small fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if it too had noticed that someone unusual had come in. "Where are you traveling from?" the innkeeper asked, when the stranger had finished eating. The stranger looked up. He thought for a moment, as if the question were difficult. Then he said, "From the east, from many cities." "And where are you going?" The stranger looked at him. "Here," the stranger said. "I am going here." The innkeeper did not know what to say to that. He nodded slowly. He gathered the empty bowl and cup. He said, "There is a small room at the end of the corridor. The window faces east. It is yours, if you wish." "Thank you," said the stranger. "I wish." He rose, picked up his bag, picked up his walking stick, and followed the innkeeper down the dim corridor to the small room at the end. The innkeeper opened the door. The room was simple. A sleeping mat on the floor, a low wooden stool, a small lamp on a shelf, a single window with a wooden shutter. The innkeeper lit the lamp from a candle he carried. He set the candle down. He bowed slightly. He left. The stranger stood for a moment in the doorway, looking into the room. Then he stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind him. The innkeeper went back to the courtyard. The other travelers had grown quieter and were beginning to make their way toward their own rooms. The fire in the brazier was burning low. The innkeeper banked it carefully with a small iron rod and stood for a while, looking at the embers, and thought about the stranger in the room at the end of the corridor. He thought, "Who is this man?" He thought, "There is something about him." He thought, "I have seen many travelers, and I have never seen one like this." And then, because he was a practical man, and because the night was deepening, and there was still work to be done, he stopped thinking about the stranger, and went to check on the horses in the back stable, and then to put out the lamps in the main hall, and then, finally, when everything was in order, to his own small room at the front of the building, where his wife had already gone to sleep, and where he lay down beside her and stared for a long time at the dark ceiling, listening to the slow, distant breathing of the Caravanserai settling into the night. Far down the corridor, in the small room at the end, the stranger had not yet lain down. He had set his bag in the corner. He had leaned his walking stick by the door. He had unwound the dusty turban from his head and set it on the wooden stool, and his dark hair fell loose around his thin face. He had washed his hands and feet at the small basin of water the innkeeper had left, and he had performed slowly the quiet evening prayer, alone on the worn carpet in the small lamplit room. And now he stood by the window. He had opened the wooden shutter. The cold night air came in, smelling of dust and wood smoke, and the faint, far-off sweetness of late autumn. The sky outside was very dark, very deep, and very full of stars. He stood there for a long time, looking up. In the room behind him, the small lamp burned. Its flame was thin and steady. It made a soft, warm circle of light on the carpet, and on the wall, and on the curve of his cloak, which he had not yet taken off. Outside, the city of Konya lay quiet under the stars. He could see, just over the low rooftops, the silhouette of a minaret against the night sky. He could see, much further off, the faint pale glow of a moon that had not yet risen fully, but was waiting, somewhere behind the eastern hills, to climb into its place. He thought about the word that had brought him here, Konya. He let the word turn in his chest. He listened to it. He did not, even now, fully understand it. He had come because the inner voice had said this name. He had come because, after so many years of searching, he had learned to trust the inner voice over almost anything else. The inner voice had been quiet for a long time. When it spoke, he listened, and it had said, Konya. And so he had walked. He looked at the stars, and the stars looked back. He thought, as he often thought at this hour, is the soul I am seeking here? In this city? Sleeping, perhaps, behind one of those walls? Praying, perhaps, in one of those mosques? Working at a desk by a candle, perhaps, somewhere not far from here? Is he near? Are we, finally, in the same small place, under the same wide sky? He did not know. He thought, in his quiet way, I will not press. I will not seek with grasping hands. I have learned by now that the one I am looking for cannot be hunted. He can only be found, and the finding is a kind of being found, a kind of meeting in which both of us are arrived at, both of us are given. So I will wait. I will walk the streets in the morning. I will see what is here. I will let the city show itself to me. And he stood there, by the window, with the cold air on his face, and he felt, in his tired body and in his quieter heart, the gentle settling of arrival, the soft easing of long travel coming, for now, to its rest. He thought of all the cities he had been to. He thought of Tabriz, and the snowy mountains, and the white morning light on the rooftops of his childhood. He thought of Damascus, and the green courtyards of its great mosque, and the smell of jasmine in the warm evenings. He thought of Baghdad, and the river there, the wide brown river that moved past the city like a slow, patient thought. He had been in all those places, and in all those places he had walked and looked and waited. and the soul he was seeking had not been there, or had been there but had not been ready, or had been ready but had not been found. He had grown used to it. He had grown used to the not finding, the way one grows used to the cool weight of a stone, carried for a long time in the pocket. But there was something different about tonight. He could not have said what it was. He could not have pointed to anything in particular. The room was simple, like 100 other rooms he had stayed in. The city outside was a city like other cities, with walls and gates and streets and houses. The sky was the same sky he had looked at from 1,000 other windows. And yet, tonight, something was different. It was as though, in the air of this place, there was a faint trembling, a faint hum, as though somewhere in the city, not too far from him, a flame was burning quietly behind a curtained window, and he could not see the flame, but he could sense the warmth of it through the dark. He could feel the warmth of it on his face almost, as he stood there at the window of the small room at the end of the corridor of the Caravanserai outside the western gate of the city of Konya. He closed his eyes. He listened. He heard, far off, the soft murmur of a fountain. He heard the faint creak of a wooden shutter swinging gently in a courtyard down the road. He heard, much further away, the soft cry of an animal in the hills. A fox, perhaps, or some other small creature, making its quiet way through the night. And under all of those sounds, he heard something he could not quite name. A quietness. A particular kind of quietness. The kind of quietness that hangs in the air just before something is about to begin. He smiled, very faintly. He opened his eyes. He looked up at the stars. "Maybe here," he said, to himself, to the sky, to the city sleeping in the dark. "Maybe here." Across the city, in a small upper room with walls lined with books, Jalaluddin had also not yet lain down. He had finished some time ago the gentle conversation with his students. He had walked back slowly through the dark streets with a single oil lamp held out before him, and he had let himself into the courtyard of his own house. And he had greeted his wife, the patient and good woman who had been his companion for many years, and he had taken a little supper with her. Some bread, some olives, a small piece of cheese, a cup of warm milk, and they had spoken quietly about small things, about a niece who was to be married, about a leak in the roof above the kitchen, about a letter that had come from a relative in another city. He had listened more than he had spoken. She had smiled at him, as she always did,
Mystics of
with the
Konya.
calm, small smile of a woman who had long ago stopped expecting words from her quiet husband, and who had long ago learned to read everything she needed in the soft attention of his eyes. She had gone to sleep. He had gone up the narrow staircase to the small upper room. He sat now at his desk, in the circle of light cast by his candle, and he held in his hands a book that he had been reading intermittently for many years. It was a book of poetry, very old, copied by some patient scribe a long time before he had been born. The pages were soft with use. The ink had faded in places. He turned the pages slowly, not really reading, just letting his eyes rest on the familiar shapes of the words. The way one rests one's gaze on the familiar shapes of trees in a garden one has known since childhood. He was a man in those days, with a settled life. He was respected throughout the city. He gave lessons in the madrasa each day, in the morning and in the afternoon. He led prayers in one of the smaller mosques. He was consulted sometimes by men of importance, who came to him with careful questions and went away thoughtful. His students loved him. His family loved him. His city loved him. His house was warm, and his books were many, and his table was always set, in the modest way that pleased him, for whoever might wander in needing a meal. He had, he would have said, if anyone had asked him, everything a man could reasonably wish for. And yet, tonight, sitting at his small desk in the upper room, turning the pages of the old book, he became aware of a feeling he had not put a name to in some time. It was a feeling that came to him every so often in the quiet hours after the city had gone to sleep. It was not unhappiness. He was not an unhappy man. It was not restlessness, exactly, though it had something of the shape of restlessness about it. It was more like, he tried to find the word, it was more like a thirst. A small, quiet thirst. A thirst that he had carried, he thought, for many years. A thirst that did not interfere with his daily life, that did not keep him from his work or his teaching or his family. A thirst that simply was. A thirst that lay underneath everything, the way a deep underground river lies beneath the dry surface of a country, never visible, but always there. He had read in his books about this thirst. He had heard it spoken of in the gentle voices of the older mystics, whose writings he kept on the highest shelves. He understood, in the careful and learned way that he understood many things, that this thirst was a holy thing, that it was, perhaps, the thirst of the soul for its own source, and that it would not be filled by any ordinary water. But understanding it had not, in all these years, made the thirst go away. He set down the book. He looked at the small candle on the desk. He watched the flame trembling in the still air, and he thought about how strange it was that a single small flame could give so much light to so dark a room, and how stranger still it was that he himself, with all his learning and all his years, had not yet found the flame that could give light to the deeper dark inside him. He smiled, faintly, at his own thought. He did not, in those days, often allow himself such poetic turns of phrase. He was a scholar. He kept his thoughts careful and orderly, but sometimes, late at night, when the city was sleeping, and he was alone with his candle and his books, a different kind of language would rise in him, soft and unfamiliar, and he would let it rise for a moment, and then put it gently aside. He stood. He went to the window. The night was very clear. The stars were many and bright, and they hung over Konya as they had hung over the city for hundreds of years, and as they would hang for hundreds of years more. He looked at them. He let them look at him. He thought of a dream he had had many years before, when he was still a young man. In the dream, he had been walking in a great empty plain under a sky like this one, when he had come upon a figure standing alone. The figure had been wrapped in a dark cloak. The figure had turned to look at him. The figure had had eyes. He remembered the eyes most vividly of all. Eyes that were like deep wells, with a fire burning somewhere far down in them. The figure had said nothing in the dream. The figure had only looked at him, and in the look there had been such a depth, such an answering depth, that he had felt, for the first and only time in his life, that he had been seen. He had woken from that dream weeping. He had not known why. He had been a young man then, sure of his learning and his place. He had pushed the dream away gently, the way one pushes away a flower offered by a stranger in the street. He had not understood it. He had not pursued it. He had gone on in the careful and orderly way he had gone on, with his studies and his prayers and his quiet life. But the dream had not gone away. It had stayed, somewhere far back in his mind, the way a small bright stone stays at the bottom of a clear river, visible only when the light comes in at a certain angle. He had not thought of the dream in a long time. He did not know exactly why it had come back to him tonight. He stood by the window, and he looked at the stars, and he thought of the figure with the eyes like deep wells, and he felt, somewhere very deep beneath his thinking, a small, quiet stirring, like a thread being gently tugged, like a leaf turning over on a still tree. He did not know what it meant. He did not, in those days, even know how to ask what such a stirring meant. He stood there for a long while. Then he turned from the window, and he blew out the candle, and he went down the narrow stairs in the dark, and he lay down beside his sleeping wife, and he closed his eyes, and after a little while, he slept. The night deepened over Konya. The stars wheeled slowly in their ancient patterns. The moon rose finally over the eastern hills and laid its pale silver across the rooftops, across the domes of the mosques, across the dry leaves in the courtyards, across the slow water of the fountains. A small dog barked somewhere far off and then was quiet. A baby cried somewhere in a house near the bazaar and was hushed and was quiet. A man in a small room at the back of a tannery turned in his sleep and dreamed of his mother. A woman by an upstairs window finished her last prayer of the night and lay down in her blankets and closed her eyes. The city breathed. The city slept. In the small upper room with the books, Jalaluddin slept. He slept the way he always slept, quietly, on his side, with his hand under his cheek. He did not dream, or if he did, the dreams were too gentle to wake him. His breath rose and fell in the slow, steady rhythm of a man who, in the deepest part of himself, was at peace, even with the thirst he could not name, even with the quiet stirring he could not understand. In the small room at the end of the corridor of the Caravanserai outside the western gate, Shams of Tabriz slept. He slept the way travelers sleep, lightly, on his back, with one hand resting on his chest, as if to feel his own heart. He did not dream either. Or if he did, the dreams were the dreams of a man who had been walking for many years and had finally come to rest. The dreams of one who knows that something is about to begin, even if he cannot yet name what it is. The two men slept in their two small rooms, in their two corners of the same city. They did not know each other. They had never seen each other's faces. They had never heard each other's names. They had lived until this night two separate lives, in two separate places, two separate currents in the great slow river of the world. But the river was moving them, and the river had brought them, that night, into the same quiet city, under the same wide stars, beneath the same patient moon. And though they slept now, each in his own small room, each unaware of the other, something had begun. Something had begun without their knowing. Something had begun when Shams had walked through the western gate. At dusk, with the road still in his bones and the dust still on his cloak, and had said to the innkeeper, "I am going here." Something had begun. It would not be hurried. It would not be loud. It would unfold, slowly, in the way that important things unfold. In glances, in chance meetings, in words half heard and half understood. In the quiet weather of days, the two men would not meet tonight. They would not meet tomorrow, perhaps, or even the day after. The city was large. Its streets were many. The currents that move people through their days are subtle, and they take their time. But the meeting was coming. The meeting was, in some sense, already underway.
Mystics of Konya.
In the way that the dawn is already underway, long before the first edge of light touches the horizon. For now, they slept. For now, the city slept. For now, the wind moved gently through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of late autumn. And the stars wheeled in their slow, patient circles, and the moon climbed quietly to the top of the sky, and somewhere, behind a high stone wall, a small fountain murmured to itself in the dark. The hours moved. It is hard to say, in the hours of deep night, how much time passes. The night does not measure itself the way the day does. There are no bells, no calls to prayer, no shifting shadows on the courtyard walls. There is only the long, slow breathing
Mystics
of the world,
Konya.
and the slow turning of the stars, and the quiet shifting of sleepers in their blankets. In his small room at the end of the corridor, Shams stirred once in his sleep. He did not wake. He only turned his face slightly toward the window where the moon was now pouring its silver into the room. The light fell on his cheek. The light fell on his hand resting on his chest. The light fell on the worn, dark cloak that lay folded over the wooden stool. He did not wake. He breathed. In his small upper room across the city, Jalaluddin stirred too. He did not wake either. He only shifted on his side, and his hand moved, and his breath caught for just a moment, and then released. Somewhere behind his closed eyes, perhaps, the figure with the eyes like deep wells stood again on the empty plain, waiting. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it was simply a small sigh in his sleep, the small sigh of a man whose life was about to change, given quietly to the night before the night itself could know. The dog barked again, far off, and then was quiet. A cat moved silently along the top of a courtyard wall. A leaf, the last of the year on a particular old apricot tree, finally let go of its branch and fell slowly, twisting once in the air, and came to rest on the cold stones of a courtyard floor, where it would lie until morning, when a sweeper would brush it gently into a small pile with other leaves. Far up in the sky, a star perhaps fell, a small bright streak across the dark, gone almost before it could be seen. And the city slept, and the two men slept, and the river of all things moved gently on, the great slow river that carries all of us, in its own time, toward the meetings we cannot see coming, toward the moments that will, one day, become the names of our lives. In the small room at the end of the corridor, sometime before dawn, Shams opened his eyes. He did not know, at first, where he was. He had slept in so many small rooms in his life that for a moment they all blurred together. Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, 100 caravanserais on 100 roads. He blinked. He saw the wooden stool. He saw his cloak folded on the stool. He saw the small lamp, long since gone out, on the shelf. He saw the window, and beyond the window, the sky, which was no longer black, but had begun, very faintly, to lighten toward the gray of early morning. He remembered. Konya. He sat up slowly. His body ached in the way that bodies ache after many days of walking. He pressed his hands gently to his face. He drew a long breath. He held the breath. He let the breath go. He did not light the lamp. The pale light coming in at the window was enough. He moved quietly, in the way of a man who had grown used to being awake before the rest of the world, the way of a man who had stood alone at the windows of many small rooms while the dawn came in. He went to the basin. He washed his hands, his face, his arms, his feet, The water was cold. The cold of it was good. He let the cold of it bring him fully into his body, into the day, into the small room, into the city outside. He performed the dawn prayer. He prayed it slowly. He prayed it the way he always prayed, with long pauses, with deep attention to every word, with his whole quiet being lifted up toward the light that was somewhere out there beyond the eastern hills, beginning very slowly to come. When the prayer was finished, he sat for a while on the carpet, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes half closed. He did not think. He did not plan. He simply sat. And the room was quiet. And the city outside, just beginning to stir, was quiet too. After a long while, he opened his eyes. He went to the window. The sky in the east had begun to grow gold along its lower edge. The stars were fading. The moon, which had moved slowly across the sky during the night, was now low in the west, pale and worn, like a small coin that had been carried for too long in a pocket. The roofs of the city were emerging slowly from the dark, taking shape, becoming themselves again. The curve of a dome, the line of a wall, the silhouette of a minaret rising patiently into the lightening sky. He looked at it all. He thought, this is a beautiful city. He thought, I will walk in it today. He thought, I will not seek. I will only walk. I will let it show me what it has. He thought, finally, with a small, soft smile, that he would not have allowed himself to wear if anyone had been watching. Perhaps he is here. Perhaps he is waking somewhere, in a house I cannot see. Perhaps he is washing his face as I just washed mine. Perhaps he is praying as I just prayed. Perhaps he does not yet know that I have come. Perhaps he will not know for some days. But perhaps. He stood there for a long time, watching the city wake. Far off, very faintly, a voice rose into the morning. The first call to prayer, drifting over the rooftops from a distant minaret. The voice was thin and clear in the cold air. It moved slowly. It said the old words. It said them as they had been said for hundreds of years, in this city and in other cities, in the long, patient way of all the dawn calls, of all the mornings the world had ever known. The voice rose. The city listened. The light in the east grew stronger. The stars were almost gone. And in his small upper room across the city, Jalaluddin opened his eyes too. He did not know, at that moment, that anything had changed. He did not know that a stranger had arrived. He did not know that a small dark figure was, even now, standing at the window of a room in a caravanserai, outside the western gate, looking toward the east, smiling faintly. He only knew that the morning had come, and that it was time to rise, and that there was, in the air of his quiet upper room, a particular kind of stillness that he had not felt in a long time. He rose. He stood for a moment in the gray light. He thought, without quite knowing why, of the dream from many years before. He thought of the figure with the eyes like deep wells. He shook his head, gently, as if dismissing a foolish thought. He smiled at himself. The small inward smile of a man who has caught himself in a moment of unreason. He went to wash for the dawn prayer. He did not know. He would not know yet, for a little while. But the river was moving. The river had brought them, both of them, into the same small city, under the same wide sky. And whether they knew it or not, whether they sought it or not, whether they were ready or not, the meeting was coming. It was coming the way the morning was coming. Slowly, patiently, inevitably, with the soft certainty of all true things. And outside, in the cool air, the first call to prayer continued, and the light came, and the city of Konya breathed itself awake into another day. The day in which everything had not yet changed. The day before the day before the day, in which two souls, walking different streets, would one morning turn a corner and lift their eyes and see finally what they had been seeking all their lives. In the small room at the end of the corridor, sometime before dawn, Shams opened his eyes. He did not know, at first, where he was. He had slept in so many small rooms in his life that for a moment they all blurred together. Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, 100 caravanserais on 100 roads. He blinked. He saw the wooden stool. He saw his cloak folded on the stool. He saw the small lamp, long since gone out, on the shelf. He saw the window, and beyond the window, the sky, which was no longer black, but had begun, very faintly, to lighten toward the gray of early morning. He remembered. Konya. He sat up slowly. His body ached in the way that bodies ache after many days of walking. He pressed his hands gently to his face. He drew a long breath. He held the breath. He let the breath go. He did not light the lamp. The pale light coming in at the window was enough. He moved quietly, in the way of a man who had grown used to being awake before the rest of the world, the way of a man who had stood alone at the windows of many small rooms while the dawn came in. He went to the basin. He washed his hands, his face, his arms, his feet. The water was cold. The cold of it was good. He let the cold of it bring him fully into his body, into the day, into the small room, into the city outside. He performed the dawn prayer. He prayed it slowly. He prayed it the way he always prayed, with long pauses, with deep attention to every word, with his whole quiet being lifted up toward the light that was somewhere out there beyond the eastern hills, beginning, very slowly, to come. When the prayer was finished, he sat for a while on the carpet, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes half closed. He did not think. He did not plan. He simply sat. And the room was quiet, and the city outside, just beginning to stir, was quiet too. After a long while, he opened his eyes. He went to the window. The sky in the east had begun to grow gold along its lower edge. The stars were fading. The moon, which had moved slowly across the sky during the night, was now low in the west, pale and worn, like a small coin that had been carried for too long in a pocket. The roofs of the city were emerging slowly from the dark, taking shape, becoming themselves again. The curve of a dome, the line of a wall, the silhouette of a minaret rising patiently into the lightening sky. He looked at it all. He thought, this is a beautiful city. He thought, I will walk in it today. He thought, I will not seek. I will only walk. I will let it show me what it has. He thought, finally, with a small, soft smile, that he would not have allowed himself to wear if anyone had been watching. Perhaps he is here. Perhaps he is waking somewhere, in a house I cannot see. Perhaps he is washing his face as I just washed mine. Perhaps he is praying as I just prayed. Perhaps he does not yet know that I have come. Perhaps he will not know for some days. But perhaps. He stood there for a long time, watching the city wake. Far off, very faintly, a voice rose into the morning. The first call to prayer, drifting over the rooftops from a distant minaret. The voice was thin and clear in the cold air. It moved slowly. It said the old, old words. It said them as they had been said for hundreds of years, in this city and in other cities, in the long, patient way of all the dawn calls, of all the mornings the world had ever known. The voice rose. The city listened. The light in the east grew stronger. The stars were almost gone. And in his small upper room across the city, Jalaluddin opened his eyes too. He did not know, at that moment, that anything had changed. He did not know that a stranger had arrived. He did not know that a small dark figure was, even now, standing at the window of a room in a caravanserai outside the western gate, looking toward the east, smiling faintly. He only knew that the morning had come, and that it was time to rise, and that there was, in the air of his quiet upper room, a particular kind of stillness that he had not felt in a long time. He rose. He stood for a moment in the gray light. He thought, without quite knowing why, of the dream from many years before. He thought of the figure with the eyes like deep wells. He shook his head, gently, as if dismissing a foolish thought. He smiled at himself. The small inward smile of a man who has caught himself in a moment of unreason. He went to wash for the dawn prayer. He did not know. He would not know yet, for a little while. But the river was moving. The river had brought them, both of them, into the same small city, under the same wide sky. And whether they knew it or not, whether they sought it or not, whether they were ready or not, the meeting was coming. It was coming the way the morning was coming. Slowly, patiently, inevitably, with the soft certainty of all true things. And outside, in the cool air, the first call to prayer continued, and the light came, and the city of Konya breathed itself awake into another day. The day in which everything had not yet changed. The day before the day before the day, in which two souls, walking different streets, would one morning turn a corner and lift their eyes and see finally what they had been seeking all their lives.